Hey there, future diplomats. I know you all are deep in UPSC prep, especially those of you taking on international relations as your optional.
Yep.
And you know what? Today we're taking a deep dive into a thinker whose ideas are going to be super helpful for those IR deep dives. We're
Yeah.
talking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
It's interesting. Rousseau isn't just some historical figure you have to, remember dates and quotes for.
Right.
He's a cornerstone of political philosophy. His ideas are still debated today, centuries later.
Yeah, and you know what the UPSC loves?
What?
Thinkers who spark debate.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's unpack Rousseau a bit.
Okay.
He was born in Geneva, bit of a rebel, wrote some really influential works. But for our deep dive today, we're focusing on his political philosophy,
Right.
and especially how it connects to IR,
Okay.
the world of international relations.
Rousseau really grappled with a question that's at the heart of international relations.
Right.
How do you balance individual freedom
Right.
with the need for order and authority?
And it's on a global scale.
Yeah.
It's something every aspiring diplomat needs to think about.
So how did Rousseau even approach this question? I feel like I remember something from my political theory notes about a noble savage.
Yes.
Was that Rousseau?
Yes, that was his idea.
Yeah.
He pictured humans in their natural state,
Okay.
before societies, as inherently good, peaceful.
Right.
He called it the noble savage.
A noble savage.
And this was different from another thinker you probably know,
Okay.
Thomas Hobbes.
Bob's.
He thought the state of nature was a war of all against all.
Right. Total chaos.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got Rousseau. He's painting this pretty picture of humans in the state of nature.
Right.
But then things go downhill. Right.
They do.
Because he wasn't a huge fan of civilization.
No, he saw civilization as the source of inequality and unhappiness.
Really?
Yeah. And for Rousseau, it was private property.
Private property.
That was the real villain in the story. It created competition, dependence.
And ultimately, it's what led to that need for a social contract to maintain order.
Now, Hobbes talked about the social contract too,
Yep,
right?
did. Yeah.
How's Rousseau's take different?
So Rousseau thought true legitimacy came from what he called the general will.
The general will.
Basically, the common good of all the people.
Okay.
Not just a majority vote,
Right.
but what's truly best for everyone.
Okay.
But, and here's the tricky part, figuring out what that general will is, that's where things get difficult.
Now that sounds like prime UPSC essay material right there.
Totally.
You could totally dissect the idea of the general will,
Yeah.
debate how to determine it, and link it to real-world examples of, like, state sovereignty.
Absolutely. It's a perfect concept to analyze. And those complexities about the general will,
Yeah.
they show a key tension in Rousseau's thought.
Okay, what's that?
How do you ensure individual freedom while also upholding this collective good? It's tough.
Yeah, that's a tough one. So we've got this idea that civilization, with all its, complexities, its inequalities, leads to this need for a social contract.
Exactly.
But how do you create a system of government that actually reflects this general will?
And that's the million-dollar question.
Right.
That's what makes Rousseau so relevant to understanding IR, international relations.
I see.
He makes us think critically about the legitimacy of power.
Right.
And not just within one country,
Right.
but on a global scale.
Globally.
And let's be real, that's something every IR aspirant needs to think about.
Yeah, so it's not just these abstract theories, right?
No,
It's tools for analyzing how power works in the real world.
exactly. Imagine you're facing a UPSC question about intervention.
Oh, okay.
Intervening in another country.
Yeah.
Rousseau's ideas about individual rights versus the general will can help you break down the arguments and come up with a good answer.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think, for our listeners.
Okay, why?
Because Rousseau's general will has been interpreted in so many different ways.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's why he's considered so controversial.
Absolutely. On one hand, his ideas about freedom and popular sovereignty,
Okay.
they inspired democratic movements.
Yeah.
But then, on the other hand, some people say his focus on the collective good.
Okay.
That led to totalitarian regimes.
Whoa. So how do we make sense of those two sides? How can one thinker be both for individual liberty and an inspiration for authoritarianism?
That's the real challenge, isn't it?
It is.
And the UPSC, they're not looking for simple answers. They want to see, you can understand the nuances, the different ways these ideas have played out, and how they still shape international relations today.
It's making me think about those late night study sessions,
Yeah.
arguing with my study group,
Oh, yeah.
trying to wrap our heads around these big ideas.
That's what makes political philosophy fun.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not just memorizing. It's about really thinking, debating, applying these ideas.
So it's not about saying, like, Rousseau was right or Rousseau was wrong.
No.
It's about understanding all sides of the debate he started.
Exactly. The UPSC wants to see that you can analyze, that you can see potential biases, that you can form your own arguments with good support. And those skills, those will be helpful way beyond the exam. They'll help you throughout your diplomatic career.
Okay. This has given me a whole new perspective on Rousseau, honestly,
Yeah.
and how his ideas connect to international relations.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how his work can help me build those analytical skills that the UPSC is looking for.
And remember, his influence goes way beyond just political theory. Think about, like, the environmental movement, the debates we have about globalization, even the anxieties around AI. A lot of these concerns echo what Rousseau was warning us about, the unintended consequences of progress.
It's like he was ahead of his time.
He really was a visionary thinker. And that's why studying political philosophy is so valuable, especially if you're interested in international relations.
Yeah.
It gives you that historical perspective.
Okay.
It helps you see recurring patterns.
Right.
And it gives you the mental tools to analyze those complex global issues.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We unpacked Rousseau's ideas on the state of nature, the social contract, the general will.
It's a lot.
It is.
Yeah.
We also talked about how his work has been interpreted in different ways.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's sparking those debates that are still shaping how we think about power, authority, legitimacy, not just within countries, but globally.
Exactly. And remember, this is just the start. We'll be back soon to dive deeper into Rousseau's legacy.
Ooh, exciting.
We'll explore how his ideas shaped events.
Okay.
How they continue to be relevant to the challenges we face in international relations today.
Now, this deep dive is full of insights, right? It's gold for any UPSC aspirant, especially those taking on the IR optional.
Absolutely.
So stick around for part 2, where we'll unpack even more of Rousseau's thought-provoking ideas. And in the meantime, why not hit that like button and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives into thinkers and topics that will give you an edge on your UPSC journey.
That's right.
We'll see you soon for part 2.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back to our deep dive on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You know, before we move on, I want to emphasize something. Rousseau's ideas, they're like a toolkit.
A toolkit?
Yeah, for anyone prepping for the UPSC, especially those of you with international relations as your optional.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So his concepts can help us understand those complicated issues in global politics.
Exactly. We're talking sovereignty, balance of power, even when it's okay to intervene in another country. All those themes directly relevant for your UPSC prep.
Very practical then.
It is. And one of the most important tools in his toolkit.
Okay, what's that?
The general will.
Ah, the general will. Now, we talked about this earlier, but it's still a bit tricky for me.
What is it?
Well, this whole thing about Rousseau being both an individualist and a collectivist.
Right.
How can he be all about individual freedom, but then also put so much emphasis on the collective good?
That's a question that's kept scholars busy for centuries.
I bet.
And it's exactly the kind of nuanced analysis that the UPSC loves to see. See, Rousseau, he believed that true freedom, it comes from being involved in creating the laws that govern us.
Okay, so participating in the system.
Yeah, and those laws, they should reflect the general will.
I see.
So it's not about giving up your individual freedom. It's about aligning what you want personally with what's good for everyone.
So it's not one or the other. It's about finding that balance. Individual freedom, and the collective good.
Exactly. Of course, then the question becomes, how do you even figure out what that common good is?
Right. Who gets to decide?
And how do you make sure it's not used to, take away individual rights?
Yeah, those are questions that are still relevant today.
Yeah.
And not just for academics, right?
Absolutely not.
Like, think about humanitarian interventions. When is it okay for the world to step in and say, hey, something's wrong here, we need to act, even if it means messing with a country's sovereignty?
Perfect example. Rousseau's ideas about the general will are right at the heart of that debate. You've got the principle of sovereignty.
Each country gets to decide for itself.
Right, and that's linked to Rousseau's idea that each nation embodies the general will of its people.
But then there's also the question of those individual rights.
Yeah.
And are there, like, universal principles that go beyond borders.
It's like a real-life UPSC question.
Totally. Which is why understanding Rousseau is so important if you're interested in diplomacy or international relations.
Right.
His ideas give you a way to look at how those things interact. Individual rights, state sovereignty, and this whole idea of the general will.
On a global scale.
Yeah, globally. Okay, so let's talk legacy. How did Rousseau's ideas actually change things historically?
Well, his impact is huge. Look at the French Revolution.
The French Revolution.
His focus on popular sovereignty, that the people hold the ultimate power, that was a big inspiration.
So his ideas helped fuel a revolution.
They certainly played a role. His writings got people thinking, you know? They fueled that discontent with the old ways, inspired demands for more rights, a more just society.
That's amazing.
Now, of course, history is never simple. You can't say one person caused this or that event.
Right.
But Rousseau's ideas, they had a ripple effect.
So the French Revolution and beyond.
And it's important to remember, his legacy has a darker side, too. Some people say his focus on the general will, that it could be twisted to justify totalitarian regimes.
Wait, how is that possible? He was all about freedom. How can he also be linked to authoritarianism?
It all comes down to interpretation, how people use his ideas in different situations.
I guess so.
Rousseau's work is complicated.
Yeah.
And his ideas have been, well, misused throughout history.
So we have to be careful.
We do. We have to engage with his work critically.
Not about picking a side, but understanding those different interpretations.
Right, and how they've shaped our world today.
Okay. So we've got the French Revolution, the general will and its complexities, but there's more to his legacy, right?
There is.
What about his impact on education?
His book, Emile, a foundational text in educational theory.
Interesting. What did he say?
He believed that education should develop the whole person, not just their mind, but their character, their morals. He was big on learning by doing, fostering a love of learning.
Those are ideas we're still talking about today.
Exactly. What is the purpose of education? What skills do we need for this century?
Right.
Rousseau's focus on holistic development, it's more relevant than ever.
So his ideas still have a lot to offer us.
They do. It's another example of how his thinking influences us today.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. The French Revolution, the complexities of the general will, his influence on education, how his work can be misinterpreted. It's safe to say Rousseau left a big mark.
To say the least. His work is still studied and debated all over the world. And his ideas, they still speak to us today, whether it's about the role of government, the balance between individual freedom and responsibility, or how to create a more just world.
I'm feeling a lot more enlightened after this deep dive.
Good.
I have one more question, though.
What is it?
Given all this, the complexities, the contradictions, what's the key takeaway for our listeners who are prepping for the UPSC, especially those focusing on international relations?
Great question. The key is this. Studying political philosophy, it's not about memorizing facts.
Right.
It's about developing a way of thinking. How does power work?
Okay.
How are societies organized? How do individuals interact with each other within and beyond their own countries?
It's not about just repeating what Rousseau said. It's about using his ideas as a lens to understand how global politics work.
That's it. And remember, Rousseau is just one piece of the puzzle.
True.
The UPSC wants you to know a range of thinkers and theories.
Okay, that makes sense.
But those skills you develop with Rousseau, thinking critically, analyzing nuances, making strong arguments, those are skills you can take anywhere.
They'll help me no matter what the UPSC throws at me.
Exactly.
I'm feeling a lot more confident about those UPSC questions now.
I'm glad to hear that.
But before we get too carried away with all this Rousseauian wisdom, I think we need to move on.
Yes. Let's see how Rousseau's ideas actually play out in international relations. What does his legacy mean for us today?
Sounds good. We'll be right back to explore those real-world examples and the impact of Rousseau's thought. Okay, we're back, ready to wrap up our Rousseau deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about how his ideas have actually had a real impact, in the world.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear some concrete examples.
Okay, well, let's start with something you'll see a lot of in your IR studies. International organizations.
Okay, like the UN.
Exactly. Think of the UN, that big stage for global diplomacy.
Yeah, the UN. What does that have to do with Rousseau?
Well, his ideas about cooperation, collective security, even the idea of a global community working together to solve problems, those all have roots in his thinking about the social contract, about going after the common good.
So even though he was writing so long ago, His ideas about how people come together to form a society,
Right.
those apply to how countries interact on the world stage.
That's it. It's recognizing that states, they're not isolated, just like individuals.
Right.
They exist in a bigger system, a global society, you could say,
Yeah.
and they have responsibilities to each other.
Okay, that makes sense. What about international law? Did Rousseau talk about that?
He didn't talk about it directly in the way we understand it now, but his ideas about the need for rules to regulate how people behave in a society,
Yeah.
those definitely apply to how we think about rules between countries.
So it's like a blueprint for how states can work together, even when they don't agree on everything.
It's more like a philosophical foundation, a way of thinking about how countries can move beyond just looking out for themselves, beyond just power, and work towards a system that's more cooperative, more peaceful.
That sounds pretty idealistic. Was Rousseau really that optimistic about people?
Well, remember, he was a complex thinker.
He was.
There's this tension. On one hand, he had this kind of dark view of human nature.
Right. Corrupted by society.
But he also believed in the possibility of a better world, one based on cooperation and the common good.
It's hard to reconcile those two things.
It is, and that's where critical thinking is so important. And that's what the UPSC is looking for. Can you engage with those difficult ideas? Can you see the contradictions and come up with your own arguments?
So it's not about saying Rousseau was right or he was wrong.
Exactly.
It's about understanding all the different aspects of his thinking.
And how those ideas have played out in the real world.
Okay, I see. So Rousseau's legacy isn't just about theories and history.
No.
It's about the challenges we face right now.
Exactly. Give me an example of a big issue in the world today.
Okay, how about the climate crisis?
Perfect. Rousseau criticized unchecked progress, right?
Yeah.
He said we need to live in harmony with nature, those ideas. They speak directly to the climate crisis, to environmental problems.
Wow, he was way ahead of his time.
Yeah.
It's like he knew what could happen if we didn't pay attention to the environment.
He raised important questions about how humans and nature should relate. And those questions, more urgent than ever.
Well, this deep dive has been eye-opening. We've covered so much, from the state of nature to the social contract, to the general will.
We have.
And it's amazing to see how those ideas still matter today.
They really do.
So for our listeners out there who are on that UPSC journey, especially those of you tackling international relations,
Yeah.
I hope this deep dive gave you some new insights.
I hope so too.
Remember, political philosophy, it's about building those critical thinking skills,
Right.
getting that framework that will help you understand how global politics work.
Don't just memorize. Engage with those ideas, analyze them, make the connections.
Well said. And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into Rousseau. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more, deep dives into thinkers and topics that matter. We'll be back soon with more analysis to help you ace that UPSC exam. Until then, happy studying.